Hey, stuffers. If you believe in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you might want to stop reading the comments section. Alex here, and welcome back to Stuff with Alex. It's a perfect Hawaiian Sunday, December 7th, 1941. The sun is shining, the Pacific Ocean is sparkling, and the vast, powerful symbol of American reach, the United States Pacific Fleet, is nestled snugly in Pearl Harbor. The officers are enjoying Sunday morning leisure. Many sailors are ashore, and the ships, massive steel fortresses, are tied up like perfect, massive, unmoving targets. The whole world is on edge, but here, everything is quiet. Too quiet. Then, just before 8 a.m., the sky splits open. In less than 2 hours, the greatest military disaster in American history unfolds. Fire, oil, explosions, and, most tragically, 2,403 American lives lost. The nation is shocked, not just by the brutality of the attack, but by its audacity. How? How in an age when signals crossed the globe faster than sound, when intelligence was supposedly paramount, did the entire American command structure, military, naval, political, miss the largest naval attack in history? Was this simply the most colossal, embarrassing, unforgivable blunder in United States intelligence history? Or was it something far darker? Did someone, somewhere, high up the chain of command, see the storm approaching and choose to let it hit, choosing American lives as a calculated sacrifice? The theory alleges that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew the attack was coming, that he intentionally sacrificed American lives and naval assets to force a reluctant, isolationist nation into World War II. This is not just a military failure we are examining. It's an accusation of calculated, catastrophic political betrayal, suggesting the United States president was willing to trade the lives of servicemen for political expediency. Today we dissect the chilling backdoor to war conspiracy. We are going deep into the declassified intelligence reports, the broken codes, the dismissed radar warnings, and the policy documents to determine once and for all if Pearl Harbor was a moment of supreme incompetence or a masterstroke of political manipulation. This episode will meticulously analyze the historical evidence, cryptological realities, and political context surrounding the attack on Pearl Harbor to determine whether the disaster resulted from colossal systemic intelligence failure or a calculated high-level conspiracy to draw the United States into World War II.
The attack on Pearl Harbor remains one of the most thoroughly investigated and analyzed events in modern history, primarily because the result, complete and overwhelming surprise, flew in the face of America's perceived technological and defensive superiority. The sheer timeline of events leading up to 7:55 a.m. on December 7th reveals a series of near misses and organizational failures that, taken together, suggest a systemic collapse. Prior to the attack, the Hawaiian Department, commanded by Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, was operating under a dangerously narrow assumption of the imminent threat. General Short had previously ordered Alert Number 1, a state of readiness that was focused almost entirely on preventing sabotage and internal unrest on Oahu. This mindset, that the threat was domestic spies rather than an offshore armada was a critical error that proved fatal. Commanders acted rationally and based on the warnings they received, which often emphasized anti-sabotage precautions and securing military installations, but never explicitly against external air or naval attack. Because they were guarding against saboteurs, American aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip to protect them from ground incursions, inadvertently making them perfect, concentrated targets for the Japanese dive bombers. Long before the first Japanese bomb fell, the United States Command in Hawaii received tangible, undeniable warnings that hostile action was underway. Yet each warning was dismissed or delayed. At 3:42 a.m. Hawaiian time, the minesweeper USS Condor spotted what appeared to be a submarine periscope near the harbor entrance. This was the first ripple of the impending tsunami. Several hours later, at 6:45 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward fired him on and successfully sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to infiltrate the harbor. This was not a suspicious observation. It was a clear, unambiguous act of war committed by a confirmed enemy vessel. The period between the Ward's hostile action and the arrival of the first air raid at 7:49 a.m. was a critical 70-minute window. An hour is considered ample time for the United States Pacific Fleet's ships to achieve general quarter status, securing watertight enclosures and preparing anti-aircraft batteries for immediate action. The fact that the air attack achieved complete surprise after the Ward's report had been sent up the chain of command demonstrates a profound failure to immediately escalate the alert level, confirming a crippling command and control issue in the island's defense infrastructure. The information was either too slow to travel through the Navy's bureaucratic structure, or the commanders lacked the decisiveness to declare a full alert based on evidence they deemed ambiguous or confusing, leading them to discount the hostile action. Perhaps the most famous failure of the morning occurred shortly after the sun rose. The United States Army had recently installed rudimentary radar systems on Oahu. At 7:02 a.m., the Opana mobile radar site detected an immense cluster of aircraft, 137 miles north of the island. Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott immediately reported the sighting to the Information Center at Fort Shafter. The radar system functioned perfectly, detecting the first wave of Japanese aircraft, but the human analysis layer failed due to expectation and lack of proper training/protocols. However, the report was dismissed by Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the inexperienced control officer, who assumed the large formation was merely a scheduled, friendly flight of American B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. This lapse demonstrates that the fault was not technological, but rooted in human analysis and expectation. The operational command failed due to confirmation bias and a lack of proper protocols for integrating new radar intelligence. The coordinated attack on airfields and ships began in earnest at 7:55 a.m., and the damage was catastrophic. The United States suffered 2,403 total fatalities, including 68 civilians, and 1,178 wounded. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was devastated. 8 battleships were severely damaged, 4 were totally lost, including the USS Arizona and Oklahoma, and 188 aircraft were destroyed. However, the Japanese success was not total. Crucially, the 3 United States aircraft carriers, the USS Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga, were absent, either delivering aircraft to Wake and Midway Islands or returning from training missions. The fact that the most vital long-range striking asset survived intact fundamentally undermines the claim that Washington intended to strategically cripple the United States fleet. Conspiracies often require perfect outcomes aligned with intent.
The outcome? Loss of obsolete battleships, but retention of future naval power in the carriers does not align with an intent to strategically cripple the United States or to achieve maximum political shock through total loss. The absence of carriers suggests this was simply luck and scheduling.
The immediate visceral response of the American public to the disaster was a demand for answers, accountability, and retribution. In this atmosphere of shock and humiliation, the search for villains began almost immediately. President Roosevelt, in his famous Day of Infamy address, channeled the nation's fury, and within days, relief was ordered from the top down. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were summarily relieved of command shortly after the attack. To investigate the disaster, President Roosevelt promptly dispatched Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox to Hawaii. Upon Knox's return, Roosevelt announced the appointment of a commission of 5 distinguished Americans, headed by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, to investigate the disaster and recommend remedial steps, which became known as the Roberts Commission. The hearings were held secretly and were notably hostile toward the area commanders. The final report of the Roberts Commission publicly blamed Kimmel and Short for dereliction of duty, making them the immediate public scapegoats for the disaster. The speed and hostility of the blaming of Kimmel and Short, followed by the revelation that early inquiries lacked the security clearance necessary to view sensitive cryptographic material, codenamed Magic, laid the foundation for the belief that Washington was executing a deliberate cover-up. If Washington was solely culpable for the intelligence failure, the fastest way to stabilize public morale was to find regional scapegoats. The Senate's non-binding resolution decades later to posthumously exonerate Kimmel and Short effectively confirmed that the real culpability lay in Washington's systemic failure to communicate and analyze critical strategic warnings. Even as the nation rallied for war, revisionist authors and isolationist politicians began to propose a more sinister explanation. This critique, often championed by writers like Harry Elmer Barnes and Charles Cullen Tansel, centered on the backdoor to war hypothesis. This theory posits that the United States government, specifically the Roosevelt administration, recognized that the American public was fiercely isolationist and would never voluntarily enter World War II in Europe. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, needing a united nation to fight Nazi Germany, sought to provoke Japan, an ally of Germany through the Tripartite Pact, into firing the first shot, thus achieving a backdoor entry into the global conflict. Tansel explicitly argued that the Roosevelt administration sought to provoke Japan into an attack on American territory, knowing such an event would inevitably involve Japan's Axis allies. Historians generally acknowledge that President Roosevelt engaged in considerable deception and manipulation to advance his foreign policy goals despite widespread public neutrality. But this political maneuver, while proving an intent to accelerate confrontation, falls short of proving specific foreknowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, let alone the intentional sacrifice of American lives. The theory hinges on policy decisions that made war inevitable, rather than tactical decisions that allowed the attack to succeed. In the narrative of intentional betrayal, the McCollum Memo is often presented as the definitive smoking gun, a blueprint for provoking a war the United States desired. On October 7, 1940, Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. McCollum of the Office of Naval Intelligence submitted a highly confidential memorandum to Navy Captains Walter S. Anderson and Dudley Knox. McCollum was deeply concerned about Japanese expansion and the United States' passive position. His memo outlined a strategy, listing 8 calculated actions intended to increase economic and military pressure on Japan. The policy steps included aggressive foreign aid, naval deployment, and severe economic warfare measures. Among the listed steps were sending a division of long-range heavy cruisers to the Orient, sending 2 divisions of submarines to the Orient, insisting that the Dutch refuse Japanese demands for oil concessions, completely embargoing all United States trade with Japan in collaboration with the British Empire, and critically, keep the main strength of the United States fleet now in the Pacific in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. The explicit goal of this aggressive strategy was laid out in the memo's final clause, which serves as the core of the conspiracy claim. If by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be fully prepared to accept the threat of war. Robert Stinnett utilized this memo as proof that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a premeditated plan to lure the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor, arguing this clause reveals the high-level plan to use Hawaii as bait. The McCollum Memo proves a high-level intent to provoke war to end isolationism. However, this provocation was strategically aimed at challenging Japan's resource acquisition in Southeast Asia, which United States intelligence universally saw as the most likely flashpoint for conflict. While moving the fleet to Hawaii was part of the 8-action plan, the primary strategic goal was to restrict Japanese access to vital resources. The memo is evidence of a calculated risk to force a geopolitical confrontation, confirming the backdoor motivation. However, the document is not evidence that the planners anticipated a surprise air raid on Hawaii itself. If the United States intelligence services had specific, reliable information that the fleet would strike Hawaii via intelligence such as Joint Navy 25 decrypts, they would have moved the fleet out of Pearl Harbor to save the ships and planes while keeping Hawaii as bait, ready for a counterattack. The inaction in Hawaii suggests they lack the specific tactical knowledge, even if they had the strategic desire for war. What's the difference between aggressive foreign policy and outright betrayal? Drop your wildest, non-dangerous theory in the comments. We want to know if you think McCollum was a visionary or a villain.
Any successful conspiracy alleging foreknowledge must overcome a towering technical hurdle: the failure to read Japanese operational intelligence. This story is defined by 2 code systems, one that the United States successfully broke and one that they did not. By 1940, United States cryptanalysts had achieved a massive intelligence coup by successfully cracking the Japanese diplomatic code known as Purple. The intelligence gathered from these intercepts was given the cover name Magic. Magic provided President Roosevelt and his highest cabinet members with valuable near-real-time insight into Japanese foreign policy. By late November 1941, Magic had provided a strategic warning that Japan was preparing to terminate diplomatic negotiations, a clear prelude to war. This diplomatic intelligence prompted Washington to send general war warnings across the Pacific, including to Hawaii. But here's the crucial distinction. Magic was diplomatic. It contained no Japanese military operational orders. Magic told Washington that war was imminent, but it did not tell them where or when the opening salvo would be fired. Most officials assumed the action would be in Southeast Asia. The critical intelligence gap was that the Imperial Japanese Navy used a completely separate, extremely complex military operational code known as JN-25. JN-25 was an intricate two-part system involving a massive codebook, approximately 27,500 entries, and a frequently changing super-enciphering additive book. American cryptanalysts struggled severely to penetrate JN-25, often prioritizing the diplomatic intercepts, magic, over the naval ones, due to the volume of traffic and limited resources. The conspiracy theory requires President Roosevelt to have known the location of the Kido Butai, the strike force, which would have only been transmitted via JN-25. The technical reality refutes this possibility. The Imperial Japanese Navy continually complicated American efforts by changing the additive book multiple times. Most critically, on December 4, 1941, just 3 days before the attack, Japan introduced a new additive book for JN-25B. This cryptographic change required United States analysts to restart the entire process of breaking the code almost from scratch. The documented consensus among cryptologic historians, including National Security Agency archives, is that United States analysts had not recovered any usable operational JN-25 decrypts prior to December 7, 1941, containing tactical information on the strike force. The key to Yamamoto's attack orders was literally being changed while the fleet was mid-ocean. This technical gap provides objective evidence against specific tactical foreknowledge at the presidential level. The intelligence process culminated in disaster early on December 7th. United States analysts in Washington had finally decoded the crucial 14-part message, the official termination of diplomatic relations, which was supposed to be delivered to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt just as the attack commenced. Realizing its importance, the final warning message was sent to Hawaii. However, the security protocol designed to protect magic was so tight that the message had to be sent via the slowest available means, telegraph followed by physical delivery to prevent enemy interception. The urgent warning reached Honolulu at 7:33 a.m. Hawaii time. But because it was Sunday morning, the Army's command was hampered by office closures. It was entrusted to a messenger on a bicycle. Halfway to his destination at Fort Shafter, the messenger sought cover in a roadside ditch as the Japanese aerial bombardment began. The decoded warning was not finally delivered until 11:45 a.m., hours after the attack ended. This chain of events showcases the failure of command. Strategic knowledge was held too tightly at the top due to the intense need to protect magic security, leading to a system where the most critical information was delivered via the least reliable method, a Sunday morning bureaucracy. The greatest organizational weakness was the failure to properly integrate and disseminate the high-level diplomatic warnings to the field commanders in an immediate, actionable format. The successful breaking of Purple led to the greatest vulnerability, a structural failure of distribution. United States Cryptanalysis Capabilities, December 1941.
To attribute the complete surprise solely to American incompetence ignores the tactical brilliance and strict operational security deployed by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The success of the attack was a product of both American error and Japanese excellence. The Japanese strike force, the Kido Butai, achieved its remarkable feat by maintaining total radio silence across 3,400 miles of ocean, approaching Oahu from the north. Any radio transmission would have allowed United States radio direction finding to pinpoint their location. Furthermore, the Japanese employed sophisticated radio dissection. Ships left behind in Japanese home waters maintained routine radio traffic using the call signs of the carriers in the strike force. This spoofing effectively convinced United States radio analysts that the main Japanese carrier fleet was still near home waters, reinforcing Washington's strategic error of focusing warnings on Southeast Asia. The Japanese success in radio deception directly explains why United States analysts felt justified in discounting the possibility of an imminent Hawaiian strike, regardless of diplomatic tensions. If the intelligence suggests the fleet is 3,000 miles away, local alerts will naturally focus on lower-level threats, like sabotage. The ambiguous war warnings that Washington did send, emphasizing preparedness against internal threats, caused commanders to prioritize preventing sabotage, a low-risk, high-probability threat, over preparing for external naval assault, a high-risk, low-probability threat. This misdirection shifted responsibility back to the source of the warning, not the field commanders who implemented it. The command's inability to integrate and act upon the clear tactical warnings that did surface locally, the midget sub sighting at 6:45 a.m. and the Opana radar blip, is the most damning failure. The intelligence was there, arriving at the base command, but the operational system was simply too slow, too rigid, and too focused on the wrong threat to exploit those final, fleeting moments of opportunity.
If the conspiracy theory attributes the disaster to malicious silence, the historical consensus attributes it to paralyzing overload. The definite analysis explaining the surprise attack comes from intelligence historian Roberta Woolstetter. Roberta Woolstetter's definitive analysis posits that the surprise was not due to a lack of signals, but the inability to distinguish the few critical warnings, the signal, from the vast amount of contradictory or irrelevant information, the noise. In Woolstetter's famous phrase, Japan's attack was presaged by a mass and variety of signals, which nonetheless achieved complete and overwhelming surprise. The intelligence was so voluminous that the nuggets were buried. Analysts, like all humans, suffer from confirmation bias. They tend to read ambiguous signals in ways that reinforce their existing expectations. Since Washington expected the Philippines to be the target, any anomaly suggesting Hawaii, like the Opana radar blip or the bomb plot message, was naturally filtered out. The bomb plot message instructing the Honolulu consul to report ship locations in specific areas of the harbor is a prime example of hindsight bias. In September 1941, this message was one of many espionage reports and was minimized or ignored by high-level officials. After December 7th, it became an unmistakable tip-off. This illustrates that warnings only become clear after the fact. If Washington were controlling events, they would have acted on the bomb plot message immediately, as it indicated specific intelligence gathering focused on Pearl Harbor's layout. The lack of action supports the model of overwhelmed analysts missing the key signal, not malicious intent. Conspiracy theories require a flawlessly executed cover-up that has lasted 80 years. The United States government made 10 official inquiries into the attack between 1941 and 1995. A plot involving the president, key cabinet members, dozens of cryptographers, intelligence analysts, and high-ranking military officials who would have to knowingly sacrifice their own careers, men, and ships is logistically implausible. Systemic failure, where no single person is responsible, but the entire structure breaks down, is a far more plausible explanation for the historical outcome. Stuffers, hit that like button
If your brain's already spiraling trying to figure out how many people would have had to keep this a secret for 80 years, it's crazy talk.
We have dissected the claims, the codes, and the command structure. Now it is time to synthesize the findings and deliver a rigorous evidence-based analysis, separating structural negligence from malicious betrayal. The greatest logical inconsistency within the sacrifice theory is the survival of the aircraft carriers. If President Franklin Delano Roosevelt intended to orchestrate a sacrifice to achieve maximum political shock, he would have ensured the carriers were present and destroyed. Their absence fundamentally contradicts the notion of intentional, calculated sacrifice. President Roosevelt secured a political victory, national unity, at the cost of less essential naval assets, while retaining the essential foundation for future Pacific victories. This result aligns with organizational error and luck, not a meticulously planned betrayal. Furthermore, almost all of the sunk battleships were eventually salvaged, repaired, and returned to service. A true sacrifice aimed at achieving catastrophic political shock would have involved destroying assets that could not be replaced or repaired quickly. The central tragedy of Pearl Harbor stems from organizational structure, not individual malice. The security protocols necessary to protect the code-breaking success of Magic were so stringent that they created an internal intelligence silo. The crucial high-level diplomatic warnings, Magic, went only to the top, isolated from the operational military analysts who needed the most. The crucial strategic picture was misunderstood or poorly disseminated, resulting in a system where synthesis of the full threat was impossible. The consensus among historians, including those reviewed by the National Security Agency, concludes that the intelligence failure was a result of bad analysis, where everybody's business became nobody's business. President Roosevelt and his staff were not guilty of malicious foreknowledge of the tactical attack if the tactical movement plans, JN-25, were unreadable. They are guilty of severe negligence and strategic miscalculation for failing to properly synthesize the diplomatic warnings and for trusting a dangerously compartmentalized Sunday morning operational system to protect the Pacific Fleet. The desire for utmost secrecy regarding Magic was so successful that it created an information vacuum for those who needed the warnings to act tactically. The fact that Congress and the Senate, decades later, sought to exonerate Kimmel and Short confirms that the culpability lay not solely in Hawaii, but primarily in Washington, D.C., where the overarching strategic picture was misunderstood or poorly disseminated. Senator Strom Thurmond referred to Cookie, Kimmel, and Short as the two final victims of Pearl Harbor, placing the ultimate blame on systemic failure in the Capitol, not just negligence in the field. This action confirms the ultimate finding that the system was structurally flawed.
The shock of Pearl Harbor did not just unify America for war. It fundamentally reshaped the architecture of the United States government and its approach to national security. The United States government commissioned 10 official inquiries into Pearl Harbor between 1941 and 1995. The final, most exhaustive investigation, conducted by the Joint Congressional Committee, 1945 to 1946, ultimately concluded that systemic failures, mismanagement of intelligence, and poor communication were the root causes. The committee's majority report recommended consolidating intelligence and drawing clear lines of responsibility among intelligence agencies. These recommendations led directly to the passage of the National Security Act of 1947. This landmark legislation was the ultimate legacy of the attack. It consolidated the military into a unified Department of Defense and, most significantly, established the Central Intelligence Agency to gather, evaluate, and synthesize intelligence across various agencies. The necessity of creating a unified intelligence and defense structure, the entire modern national security state, Department of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency, was the painful, expensive, and necessary outcome of the institutional failure to coordinate intelligence on December 7, 1941. This response confirms that the system was fundamentally flawed, not that a single man orchestrated the event. If a conspiracy were discovered, the solution would have been treason trials. Instead, the solution was systemic reorganization. Pearl Harbor remains an enduring source of conspiracy theories because the accepted truth that a catastrophic failure of imagination, bureaucracy, and simple human error could lead to such immense loss is profoundly unsatisfactory. The enduring conspiracy theories are a symptom of our collective unwillingness to accept that disaster can stem from simple, mundane human failures. The true lesson of Pearl Harbor is that the greatest dangers often reside not in the obvious threats, but in the unseen gaps within our own systems. The places where information gets delayed by a Sunday slowdown or dismissed by an overworked junior officer. The real villain was the signal-to-noise ratio. If the National Security Act was the necessary evil born from Pearl Harbor's failure, what current intelligence threat do you think will lead to the next major restructuring of United States Command? Let us know in the comments below.
The analysis of the intelligence trail, the unreadable codes, and the political decision-making leading up to December 7, 1941, confirms that the Pearl Harbor disaster was not the result of a calculated high-level conspiracy. Instead, it was the climax of an intelligence failure so profound that it took a war to fix it. We can conclude that the Roosevelt administration was guilty of aggressive, risky, and perhaps duplicitous foreign policy aimed at provoking Japan into firing the first shot, thereby providing the back door to engaging Germany. The McCollum Memo confirms an intent to create confrontation, but the administration was not guilty of tactical foreknowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The evidence is overwhelming. The most valuable assets, the carriers, survived. The operational code, JN-25, was unreadable, and the tactical warnings, the radar and the sub, were received but discarded due to deeply ingrained assumptions and a dangerously compartmentalized distribution system. Washington provided the strategic atmosphere for war, but Hawaii provided the operational failure that allowed surprise. The truth of Pearl Harbor is both more horrifying and less sensational than the conspiracy alleges. It was not a calculated plot of presidential betrayal, but a failure of organizational architecture, a vast, intricate system that was choked by its own secrecy, its own biases, and its own arrogance. The enemy wasn't the information. It was the collective failure to understand what the information meant. The lesson of Pearl Harbor for me always comes down to the necessity of humility in the face of uncertainty. We look for hidden malice because it's a simpler explanation than the crushing weight of institutional error. But history often shows us that the biggest disasters happen not because a villain planned them perfectly, but because dozens of ordinary people missed small, seemingly irrelevant clues. Perhaps the ultimate lesson comes down to humility and the limits of human knowledge. Captured well in this ancient observation, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9. Man planned for peace. Man planned for war. And in the end, the system broke. The Japanese planned for surprise, but fate removed their most valuable targets. History is often dictated not by perfect plans, but by the unpredictable movement of steps we never saw coming. Okay, thanks for watching. Peace out. Goodbye, guys.